The translation audit had been running for 6 hours when the Vethani delegation exhaled their ancestors. That was the closest Ashkani could come to describing it afterward. A collective exhalation, 17 bodies venting in synchronized biochemical chorus, and then the air in the conclave chamber changed. Not the temperature, not the pressure, something older and more absolute than either. The air became thick with something her hindbrain recognized before her cortex did, something that said, "Yield. Lie down. This is not a conversation you are part of." Around her, 6 delegations folded. The Kravath et Hashay, a being whose home atmosphere was 40% methane, and who had survived 3 docking failures, simply sat down on the floor. The Solen pair went glassy-eyed and pressed their foreheads to the table. The Dreth observer made a sound like a rupturing membrane and curled around itself in the corner. Ashkani stood up straighter. It wasn't a decision. Her knees bent reflexively at the first chemical wash, a deep animal acknowledgement that the room had changed, and then something else fired underneath it, older than the reflex, older than the instinct. The part of her that had grown up in a species that had spent 100,000 years refusing to be prey. She felt the pressure, she stood in it. At the head of the chamber's raised dais, Council Arbiter Tinvas was already reading the ratification declaration into the record. The Verath Sanction, formal galactic designation of Earth's border action as species aggression, suspension of humanity's compact rights pending tribunal. It was being fast-tracked. The session that was supposed to last 3 days had been compressed into 1, and the compression had a smell to it. The same smell as the air. Sesthariel watched the human from the Vethani observation tier. The Vethani experienced the present moment as a palimpsest, the now written over the then, every current sensation running alongside the chemical memory residue of decisions their ancestors had made in analogous situations. Sesthariel was a senior resonance scholar, which meant the palimpsest ran deep. 17 generations of diplomatic memory vibrated in their receptor nodes. None of those 17 generations had a record of a being remaining upright in a full consensus flood. They cataloged what they were observing, the human's posture, not rigid, not braced, simply continuous, as though the flood was whether she had decided to stand in rather than a force she was resisting. Her respiration had elevated. Her chemistry was outputting distress signals she either couldn't suppress or wasn't trying to. But her feet were flat on the floor and her eyes were on the arbiter and she was raising her hand. "Point of order," Ashkani said. "Article 7, right of direct address before ratification." The room, already chemically compelled toward agreement, reacted to the interruption like a body reacts to a splinter, a systemic flinching, an attempt to close around the intrusion and neutralize it. Arbiter Tinvas paused mid-declaration. The pause was long enough. "Article 7 is in effect," the arbiter said, because it had to. Because even the Vethani consensus flood couldn't rewrite the compact's procedural architecture in real time. The floor recognizes the human attaché. Ashkani looked around the chamber. 6 delegations on the floor. 1 Vethani tier watching her with 17 generations of banked confusion. "I'm going to need everyone to be able to hear this," she said. "So I'd appreciate it if the Vethani delegation gave us the room back." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before. Sesthariel found themselves nodding it in the old way, the way their third ancestor had noted the first time a tidal creature from the deep shelf had walked up the beach and refused to go back. "Curious," that ancestor's chemical trace said. "Extremely curious." The vote was suspended. Earth had 72 hours. Ashkani sat back down at the translation station, alone in a chamber that smelled like 17 generations of other people's certainty, and began to build her case. The interface room assigned to the Vethani human bilateral was neutral atmosphere, which meant it smelled like nothing, and Sesthariel found it difficult to think clearly. They arrived with the residue of the morning session still processing through their receptor nodes, Not quite memory, not quite present sensation, but the thick middle state that the Vethani called the slow settling, when the ancestors' experiences were still vibrating against the current moment and hadn't yet been integrated into the body's permanent record. Sesthariel had 17 such records running when they entered the room. The chamber in their body where ancestor memory pooled was, at the moment, the fullest it had been in a decade. They had requested the bilateral, because the human was a variable they could not resolve. The Vethani processed reality through consensus, not as philosophy but as physiology. A Vethani acting against the resonance of their collective memory experienced physical discomfort escalating to organ distress if the divergence was sustained. This meant that Vethani individuals did not surprise each other very often. The shape of a Vethani's behavior could be predicted from the sediment of their lineage's decisions, the way a geologist predicts a fault line. The pattern was the person. Ashkani had no sediment Sesthariel could read, no ancestor memory in the air, no chemical history preceding her presence. She arrived, each time, as a pure immediate event, uncontextualized by anything that had come before. This was, Sesthariel was discovering, deeply disorienting. "You want to know how I knew," Ashkani said, before Sesthariel had fully settled into the interface position. She was at the table already, the way humans were always already somewhere, always a step ahead of their own arrival. "We want to understand," Sesthariel said. The Vethani plural for singular was not affectation. It acknowledged the ancestors riding along. The consensus flood has an effect on all carbon-based neurology. The Kravath delegate has endured worse atmospheric conditions than any being we have observed. They sat on the floor. "Yeah," Ashkani looked at her hands. Not performing, simply looking, the way Sesthariel's second ancestor had looked at new tide marks on old stone, reading something. The Kravath respond to atmospheric shifts as threats to physical survival. Their nervous system routes those signals through a threat assessment hierarchy. Yield is a survival option. And yours is not. Mine routes it differently. She didn't elaborate. The chemical trace she was outputting said she had no intention of elaborating. Sesthariel noted this. The way certain information was present in a human's chemistry, but sealed behind something that wasn't deception. More like a door that was closed not to conceal what was behind it, but simply because the room was not one she was inviting anyone into. The bilateral had been underway for perhaps 20 minutes when Ashkani's wrist unit flashed. She looked at it. The flash came again, 3 rapid pulses, a pattern Sesthariel did not know but whose regularity suggested a priority code. Ashkani's chemistry shifted, not spiking, descending. A stillness that was not calm, the way a deep current was not still water. She read the message, 4 seconds of absolute quiet. "The Argent Bridge has crossed the Vareth boundary marker," she said. "That's our second ship. Moving to withdraw. Moving deeper in." She set her wrist unit face down on the table, not hiding it, done with it. "I need you to understand something, and I need you to tell me honestly whether the Council's inner quorum knows it already." Sesthariel's receptor nodes pulsed. The ancestors were paying attention. "The meridian," Ashkani said. The chemical memory response was involuntary, 17 generations of recorded sensation flooding through Sesthariel's processing nodes at once, a cascade so fast it registered as a physical jolt. The meridian was in the record. Of course it was in the record. A colony ship, 841 civilians, declared lost in transit 7 months ago. The Council's official notation: equipment failure. Acceptable attrition in deep fringe navigation. Acceptable attrition. 2 words that had been in the ancestor record, settled into sediment, integrated into the body's permanent acceptance of a thing that had happened. Sesthariel had not questioned them. Their lineage had not questioned them. The consensus was, this was a loss. Losses occurred. The universe was large and vessels were small. Ashkani slid a data chip across the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't look away. Sesthariel picked it up. The chip contained a single file, the Meridian's final transmission, time-stamped, unredacted, and then the transmission's routing record where it had gone, what had intercepted it, and what decision had been made about whether to release it to the galactic public record. The transmission had not been lost, it had been received. The decision had been made by a subcommittee of the Council's inner quorum. Sesthariel set the chip down. Their receptor nodes were flooding, not with ancestor memory now, but with something that had no name in the Vethani vocabulary. A rupture between what the sediment said was true and what their direct sensory apparatus was presenting as true. The sensation was close to what they understood from old medical literature as pain. "Tell me," they said, "what the transmission says." "The Meridian was escorted out of Vethani space," Ashkani said. "Weapons hot, no warning, no claim of violation. Their distress signal was active and received by a council relay station for 6 hours before it went quiet." She paused. Not for effect. She seemed to be choosing whether to say the next part. Earth's first border crossing was a search and rescue operation. The council classified it as aggression while they were still pulling survivors out of the debris field. Sesthariel did not speak for a long time. Ashkani waited. Sesthariel was nodding somewhere underneath the flooding sensation, extremely good at waiting. The way certain creatures were good at it, not passively, not bidding time, but with a coiled quality, a readiness that didn't announce itself. "I will request an emergency session," Sesthariel said at last, "with the inner quorum." "Good." They rose, stopped, turned back. "The second ship," Sesthariel said, "the Argent Bridge." "Still moving," Ashkani said. "It's not going to stop." They left. In the corridor outside, alone for the first time since morning, Sesthariel let the ancestor memory flood, all 17 generations pressing forward with their records, their patterns, their accumulated sediment of how things worked. Every one of them cross-referenced against the data chip now sitting on a table in a neutral atmosphere room. None of them had recorded anything that matched what Sesthariel had just been handed. They had a word in Old Vethani for the moment when an individual's personal observation overrode the collective sediment. It was not a common word. It was the word for the state that preceded a species changing its understanding of itself. It translated approximately as the cracking. The inner quorum's biological consensus chamber had been grown over 900 years. Not built, grown. The walls were Vethani tissue, a slow accretion of living membrane contributed by every generation of senior delegates since the chamber's founding, each layer a literal deposit of ancestral presence. To stand inside, it was to stand inside a 9th-century fossil of collective decision-making. Every deliberation the inner quorum had ever held was chemically encoded in the walls. Every consensus they had ever reached was still releasing, faintly, into the air. Sesthariel had been in this chamber 14 times. Each time the weight of accumulated certainty had been, above all, steadying. The chamber said, "We have always known. We have always decided well. The sediment is deep here. You may trust it." Today the chamber said something different. Ashkani was brought in as a witness, which was irregular. Humans were not typically permitted in spaces of Vethani biological governance, not because of prohibition, but because the consensus chemistry had an effect on non-Vethani physiology that the Vethani considered impolite to inflict in a closed space. She stood near the chamber's single entrance and said nothing. She had said nothing since the transit here. Whatever she was carrying it the way she seemed to carry everything. Internally, at significant depth, without apparent structural compromise. Sesthariel stood at the archivist's terminal and began the access sequence. The inner quorum's senior members watched. 12 beings, each carrying centuries of lineage memory in their receptor nodes. The chamber's living walls pulsed with slow chemical endorsement. the sediment agreeing with itself, as it always did, the great consensus running like a tide through stone. Sesthariel submitted the meridian file to the archivist's cross-reference function. The function ran. The chamber's chemistry shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but in the way that deep water shifts before a current inverts. The quorum's ancestral record had an entry for the meridian. Of course it did. The council had generated one. Sesthariel watched the cross-reference tool compare that entry, line by line, against the relay station's raw transmission logs that had been quietly archived in the secondary record by someone who had not known what they were preserving. The entries did not match. This was not in itself unusual. Records diverged. Clerical errors occurred. The cross-reference tool was generating a standard variance report. And then the archivist made a sound. It was not a loud sound. The Vethani archivist was a very old being, 4 generations of memory dense in their body, and the sound they made was the sound of 4 generations making contact with a fact that contradicted the sediment simultaneously. A cellular sound. Involuntary, the way bleeding was involuntary. The cross-reference was not showing a variance. It was showing an excision. Someone had entered the inner quorum's ancestral record, the 9th century living archive encoded in these walls and in the bodies of every senior delegate who had ever sat in this chamber, and cut something out. Not edited. Cut. The chemical trace where the original record had been was still there, a ghost impression, a scar where living tissue had been removed. The quorum registered it. 12 beings in a chamber built for consensus, and the consensus broke. The walls felt it before the delegates did, a ripple through the living tissue. 900 years of accumulated agreement encountering a discontinuity. It had no architecture to process. Chemical signals began cascading in the wrong directions. Delegates who had not experienced biological descent in their working lifetimes found it arriving now, unbidden, as a physical sensation. Their own receptor nodes outputting contradiction against the chamber's endorsement flood. 3 delegates sat down heavily. 2 began producing the low resonance the Vethani used for distress. The archivist's hands on the terminal started to shake. Ashkani was moving before Sesthariel had time to register that the archivist was losing the upload sequence. She crossed the chamber without hesitation. Later, Sesthariel would try to reconstruct what she had understood in those seconds, the archivist shaking, the terminal's upload timer running, the fact that if the cascade continued and the quorum's distress state peaked, the chamber's biological emergency protocols would seal the archive against further access. She had understood all of it. Sesthariel had taken 3 seconds to begin processing. Ashkani had used those 3 seconds to be already there. She didn't push the archivist aside. She reached across and steadied their hands, both of hers over both of theirs, not overriding, just stabilizing. The archivist was 4 generations old. Their hands were trembling with the weight of what their ancestral record had just confirmed. Ashkani's hands were steady. The upload continued. "It's almost done," Ashkani said quietly to the archivist, not to the chamber, not to the quorum, to the specific being whose hand she was holding. The archivist made a sound that Sesthariel's receptor nodes translated, imperfectly, as, "I see it now." The upload completed 12 seconds later. The unaltered record surfaced into the public archive, not the quorum's private sediment, not the council's curated record, but the Galactic Compact's common store, where it could not be excised again, where every member species archivist would cross-reference it within the hour, where the chemical memory of what had actually happened to the meridian would become sediment in 1,000 different species records, impossible to cut out of all of them. The quorum was very still. Sesthariel looked at Ashkani, who had released the archivist's hands and taken 2 steps back. Her chemistry was outputting something that Sesthariel had no Vethani vocabulary for, a compound of exhaustion and resolution, and something underneath both of them that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and had the character of a very old thing that had been carried a long time. The Council's border action, Sethariel said. The classification of Earth's rescue operation as species aggression. Is on the same record, Ashkani said. Yes. The faction responsible. 3 senior quorum members and a relay station administrator. She looked at the chamber walls, the living tissue, 9 centuries of accumulated presence. Your archive probably already knows who they are. That's what archives are for. The chamber's walls pulsed once, with something that was not endorsement. The Vethani had a concept for sacrifice within the hive, the individual who absorbed cost so the collective could continue. It was an honored thing, a thing with a ceremony and a name. Sethariel stood in the chamber where 900 years of their species' decisions lived in the walls, watching a human take 2 steps back from a terminal she had just used to burn down a cover story, and understood, with a precision that would settle into their own sediment and pass to whatever generation came after them, that the Vethani concept and the human concept were not the same thing at all. The Vethani word for sacrifice required the collective to know, required the recognition. The individual stepped forward because the hive saw and honored the stepping. Ashkani had steadied a stranger's hands in a room full of beings in biological crisis, because the truth needed to finish uploading, and that was the whole of it. No ceremony, no name. The compact-wide archive pinged its confirmation. Outside the chamber, somewhere in the dark between star systems, the Argent Bridge was still moving.